the flickering light. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Alex, Emma, Ryan, and Sophia had planned this camping trip for weeks, eager to escape the city's noise and enjoy the tranquility of the wilderness. The group of friends arrived at the edge of the forest just before sunset, their SUV packed with supplies and excitement. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the air crisp and filled with the earthy scent of pine. "This is perfect," Emma said, stepping out of the car and stretching. She looked around at the towering trees that seemed to touch the sky. "Exactly what we needed. Let's set up camp before it gets dark," Ryan suggested, grabbing a bundle of tent poles. The others nodded in agreement, and within an hour, their camp was ready. 2 tents stood side by side near a clearing, a small fire crackling in the center. The forest around them was dense, the trees forming a natural wall that felt both protective and ominous. As the evening deepened, the group sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Laughter echoed through the clearing, blending with the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Did you know this forest is supposedly haunted?" Alex said suddenly, his tone teasing. He leaned forward, the firelight casting shadows across his face. Emma groaned. "Come on, Alex. Don't start with your creepy stories." "No, seriously," Alex continued, undeterred. "They say strange things happen here. People report seeing lights deep in the woods at night. Lights that don't belong to any flashlight or lantern. And those who go looking for them, well, they don't come back." "Cut it out," Sophia said, tossing a marshmallow at him. "You're gonna freak Emma out." "I'm not freaked out," Emma retorted, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's just a silly story." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and soon the fire began to die down. One by one, they retreated to their tents, the laughter giving way to the soothing sounds of the forest at night. But Alex couldn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent's fabric ceiling. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet now, as if holding its breath. Then he saw it, a faint flickering light through the thin material of the tent. At first, he thought it was a reflection of the dying fire, but it moved, darting between the trees. Curious and a little unnerved, Alex unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to wake Ryan, who was snoring softly beside him. The night air was cold, biting at his skin as he stepped out. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and the fire had reduced to a few glowing embers. The light was still there, moving deeper into the woods. It was pale, almost ethereal, like a will-o'-the-wisp from the fairy tales his grandmother used to tell him. "Hey guys," Alex whispered, kneeling near the other tent. "Wake up," Sophia groaned, her head poking out of the tent flap. "What is it?" "There's a light out there," Alex said. "It's moving. Come look." "Probably just a firefly," Sophia muttered, rubbing her eyes. "Fireflies don't move like that. Just come see." Reluctantly, Sophia and Emma crawled out of the tent, followed by Ryan, who looked thoroughly annoyed at being woken up. "There," Alex said, pointing. "Do you see it?" They all fell silent as they watched the light. It was faint but undeniably there, weaving through the trees like it had a mind of its own. Emma shivered. "What is that?" "Let's find out," Alex said, grabbing a flashlight. "Are you insane?" Sophia hissed. "You just told us a creepy story about people disappearing after chasing lights. And now you want to chase one?" "It's probably nothing," Alex said with a grin. "Besides, we're together. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, the group followed Alex, their own flashlights cutting through the darkness. The light ahead seemed to move faster as they approached, almost as if it was leading them somewhere. The deeper they went, the denser the forest became. The air grew colder, and the cheerful chirping of crickets was replaced by an eerie silence. After what felt like an eternity, the group found themselves in a small clearing. In the center stood an old, gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The light hovered near the base of the tree before disappearing entirely. "That's unsettling," Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's just a trick of the light," Emma said, though she didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. "Let's go back," Sophia said urgently. "Now!" The group turned to leave, but the path they had come from was gone. The trees seemed to have shifted, their trunks forming an impenetrable wall around the clearing. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. "Stay calm," Alex said, though his voice wavered. "We'll find another way out." As they searched for an exit, the whispering grew louder, echoing around them. Shadows began to move among the trees, too large and too fast to be animals. Emma clutched Ryan's arm tightly, her breathing ragged. "What's happening?" she whispered. Before anyone could answer, the light reappeared, this time directly in front of them. It was brighter now, almost blinding, and it pulsed like a heartbeat. The group froze, unable to look away as the light began to take shape. It morphed into a figure, its features indistinct but undeniably human. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at Alex. "Run!" Alex shouted, snapping out of his trance. The group scattered, darting in different directions in a desperate attempt to escape. The last thing Alex saw before plunging into the darkness was the figure's face, or rather, the lack of one. It was smooth and featureless, a blank canvas where a face should have been. The forest became a labyrinth of shadows and terror, and Alex could hear the others calling out for him, their voices distant and frantic. The light was gone, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Every crack of a branch and rustle of leaves made his heart pound harder. Finally, he stumbled into another clearing, collapsing to his knees. His flashlight flickered, casting weak beams that barely illuminated his surroundings. He was alone, or so he thought. A soft chuckle echoed behind him, low and guttural. Alex spun around, but there was nothing there. The laughter grew louder, coming from all directions. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again, the flickering light, closer this time. It wasn't leading him anywhere now. It was hunting him. Laughter in the dark. The forest around the campsite was alive with the symphony of nocturnal creatures. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl punctuated the darkness. Emma, Ryan, Alex, and Sophia were huddled around the campfire, their laughter filling the clearing as they shared stories. The fire cast dancing shadows on the trees, creating an ever-shifting mural of light and dark. "All right, who's next?" Ryan asked, leaning back against a log and taking a sip from his flask. "I've got one," Alex said, leaning forward with a mischievous grin. "But it's not for the faint of heart." "Oh, come on," Sophia said, rolling her eyes. "Every time you say that, it's some ridiculous story about a ghost or a monster." "Not this time," Alex replied, his tone serious. He glanced around the group, the firelight catching his eyes. "This one is real." "Real?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with skepticism but also curiosity. "Okay, let's hear it." Alex began his tale, spinning a story about a mysterious laughter that haunted these very woods. According to him, the locals called it the Laugher, a spirit that lured campers away from their sites with its eerie, childlike giggles. Those who followed the sound were never seen again. And they say, Alex concluded, lowering his voice, "if you hear the laughter, you must never respond. It's how it chooses its victims." The group sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Then Sophia broke the tension with a laugh. "Nice try, Alex. That's the oldest trick in the book." Ryan smirked. "Yeah, you're not scaring anyone." "Fine, don't believe me," Alex said with a shrug, leaning back. "But don't say I didn't warn you." The group chuckled and resumed their banter, the story quickly forgotten. As the fire began to die down, they decided it was time to call it a night. They doused the embers, zipped up their tents, and settled in for sleep. But the laughter started just after midnight. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a breeze rustling through leaves. Then it grew louder, more distinct, high-pitched and childlike. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees and surrounding the campsite. Emma sat bolt upright in her sleeping bag, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, nudging Sophia awake. "What is it?" Sophia mumbled groggy. The laughter came again, closer this time. Sophia's eyes widened as she sat up, her breath hitching. What the hell was that? Ryan and Alex emerged from their tent, flashlights in hand. Did you guys hear that? Ryan asked, his voice tense. It's just some animal, Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. Animals don't laugh like that, Emma said, clutching her flashlight tightly. The laughter came again, this time from the opposite direction. It was louder now, unmistakably human, but wrong in a way none of them could articulate. The sound sent shivers down their spines, the kind of chill that seeped into their bones. Stay together, Ryan said, his voice firm. Let's check it out. It's probably someone messing with us. They moved as a group, their flashlights cutting through the dense darkness. The laughter continued, shifting locations with impossible speed. It was as if the forest itself was mocking them. Every time they thought they were getting closer, the sound would come from a different direction. This isn't possible, Emma whispered, her voice trembling. How can it be everywhere? It's not real, Alex said, though sweat beaded on his forehead. It's just our minds playing tricks on us. But as they pressed on, the laughter began to change. It grew deeper, more guttural, losing its childlike quality. The sound was no longer playful. It was menacing. They stumbled into a clearing, their breaths visible in the suddenly frigid air. In the center stood a figure, its back turned to them. It was small, childlike in stature, but its proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. Who's there? Ryan called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Then slowly it began to laugh. The sound was low and rumbling, filling the air and vibrating through their chests. The group froze, unable to look away as the figure turned to face them. It had no eyes, only hollow sockets that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Run! Alex shouted, breaking the spell. They scattered, darting into the forest in different directions. The laughter followed them, echoing in their ears no matter how far they ran. Trees blurred past as they stumbled over roots and underbrush, their lungs burning from exertion and fear. Emma tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. She scrambled to her feet, but the laughter was right behind her now, impossibly close. She turned, her flashlight shaking as she pointed it into the darkness. Nothing was there, but then the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. Emma's heart pounded in her ears as she looked around, her breath hitching. Then a voice, low and raspy, whispered in her ear, "Found you." She screamed. The call from the lake. The forest surrounding the lake was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the gentle night breeze. The group of 6 friends had set up camp earlier that evening, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they pitched tents and gathered wood for a fire. It was meant to be a weekend of escape from their busy lives, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. Mai, the youngest in the group, had always loved the serenity of the outdoors. The lake, in particular, held a strange allure for her. Its still surface reflected the pale moonlight, creating an almost otherworldly glow. She stood by the water's edge as the others joked and roasted marshmallows around the campfire. Something about the lake, its silence, its stillness, seemed to call to her. "Meh, come on, we're telling ghost stories," shouted Nam, her best friend since childhood. Mai tore her gaze away from the lake and smiled. Coming. The group's ghost stories grew, increasingly exaggerated as the night went on. Tales of haunted trails, mysterious lights in the woods, and phantom campers filled the air. Mai found herself only half listening, her mind drifting back to the lake. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. Around midnight, the group began to tire. One by one, they retreated to their tents, the campfire reduced to a smoldering glow. Mai shared a tent with Lynn, her roommate from university. Lynn fell asleep almost instantly, but Mai lay awake, her ears attuned to the sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets was soothing at first, but gradually, the noises seemed to fade. A heavy silence settled over the campsite. Then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the air. It wasn't coming from the campsite or the forest. It was coming from the lake. Mai sat up, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, faint and melodic, calling her name, Mai. Her heart raced. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the voice called again, more insistent this time. It was impossible to ignore. Against her better judgment, Mai grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as she could. Lynn stirred but didn't wake. The night air was colder than she expected, and the beam of her flashlight barely pierced the darkness. She made her way toward the lake, her footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. The voice continued to call her name, drawing her closer. It wasn't frightening, not exactly. It was hypnotic. When she reached the lake, Mai's breath caught in her throat. A figure stood at the water's edge, its back turned to her. It was small, childlike, with long, dark hair that hung in wet strands down its back. The figure was unnaturally still, its presence both strange and unsettling. "Hello," Mai called hesitantly. Her voice sounded foreign in the oppressive silence. The figure didn't move or respond. Instead, it began to hum, a haunting, lilting melody that sent chills down Mai's spine. Against her better judgment, she took a step closer. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Do you need help?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if hearing her for the first time. Then, slowly, it began to turn. Mai's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled with the switch, her hands trembling, but when she finally got the light back on, the figure was gone. Mai's heart pounded in her chest. She scanned the area with the flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone. The lake surface was as smooth and undisturbed as glass. She was about to turn back when she heard a splash. Whipping around, she saw ripples spreading across the water. Something or someone had just entered the lake. A sense of dread washed over her. She wanted to run, to scream for her friends, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The voice called her name again, this time from the center of the lake. "Mai, come here." Against her will, she found herself stepping into the water. It was icy cold, and the chills seemed to seep into her very bones. The further she waited, the stronger the voice became, until it was all she could hear. Just as the water reached her knees, a hand grabbed her shoulder, yanking her back with force. Mai screamed, spinning around to see Nam standing behind her, his face pale with fear. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "You're sleepwalking or something. Come back to the camp." Mai blinked, the spell broken. She allowed Nam to pull her out of the water, her body trembling uncontrollably. When they returned to the camp, she tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Nam didn't press her, though his concern was evident. The next morning, Mai's friends noticed how quiet she was. She didn't mention the voice or the figure by the lake, afraid they would think she was crazy. But as they packed up their belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they drove away, Mai glanced back at the lake. In the distance, she thought she saw the figure standing on the shore, its hollow eyes fixed on her. She never went camping again. The shadow by the campfire. It was a perfect autumn evening for camping. The Nguyen family, Han, her husband Min, and their 10-year-old son, Bao, had chosen a secluded spot in the heart of the woods. The crisp air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl added to the serene ambience. They had set up their tents earlier in the day, and now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a warm campfire crackled in front of them. Han smiled as Bao eagerly poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the air. Min was busy unpacking marshmallows and skewers, ready to teach Bao how to roast them to golden perfection. It was their first family camping trip, and they had hoped it would be a bonding experience, a break from the distractions of everyday life. As the night deepened, Bao's curiosity about the forest grew. He peppered his parents with questions about the animals that might be hiding in the trees and the sounds echoing through the darkness. Eventually, he asked, "Can we tell scary stories like they do in the movies?" Min chuckled. All right, but nothing too scary. We don't want to give you nightmares. Bao grinned and settled onto a log, his marshmallow forgotten. Min started with a classic tale about a ghostly wanderer who haunted a nearby hiking trail. Han followed with a story about a mysterious light that lured campers away, never to be seen again. Bao listened intently, his wide eyes reflecting the flickering flames. As the last echoes of Han's story faded, Bao suddenly pointed toward the treeline. "There's someone standing over there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Han and Min turned to look, their gazes scanning the shadows. The trees stood still, their dark silhouettes blending into the inky night. There was no one there. "It's just your imagination," Min said, patting Bao's shoulder. "The stories are getting to you." But Bao shook his head. "No, I saw someone. They were standing right there between those two trees." Han frowned, her maternal instincts kicking in. "It's probably just an animal. Let's not scare ourselves for no reason." Despite their reassurances, Bao seemed uneasy. He kept glancing toward the spot he had pointed out, his shoulders tense. Han and Min decided it was time to call it a night. They doused the campfire, leaving only a faint trail of smoke curling into the cool night air. The family retreated to their tent, the zipper sealing them inside. Bao snuggled into his sleeping bag between his parents, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves outside made him flinch. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, Han awoke to a sound. It was faint at first, like the shuffle of feet on dry leaves. She held her breath, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, circling the tent. Her pulse quickened. She nudged Min awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Min groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. The sound continued, now unmistakable. It was footsteps, deliberate and slow, as if someone was walking around their campsite. Min's protective instincts kicked in. He grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine a beam outside. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty campsite and the surrounding trees. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as though the intruder had vanished. Min stepped out cautiously, scanning the area, but found no trace of anyone. "Maybe it was an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He returned to the tent, zipping it tightly behind him. Morning came, bringing with it a sense of relief. Han and Min chalked up the previous night's events to overactive imaginations and the eerie quiet of the forest. Bao, however, was unusually quiet as they prepared breakfast. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Han asked, noticing his downcast expression. Bao hesitated before saying, "I saw them again." Han's stomach dropped. "Saw who?" "The person from last night," Bao replied. "They were standing by the fire pit, watching us." Han exchanged a worried glance with Min. They decided to cut their trip short. As they packed up their gear, an unsettling discovery stopped them cold. Around the campsite, in the dirt and fallen leaves, were footprints. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. The prints circled their tent and led to the fire pit before disappearing into the forest. The realization sent chills down their spines. Hastily, they finished packing and left the woods, their plans for a relaxing getaway forgotten. As they drove away, Bao turned to look out the window. In the distance, by the edge of the forest, a shadowy figure stood among the trees, watching them leave. They never went camping again. The empty tent. The sun was just beginning to set as the three friends arrived at the base of the hill. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine. Min, Lon, and Fong had been planning this camping trip for weeks, eager to escape the noise and chaos of the city. The hilltop promised a stunning view of the valley below, and the isolation was exactly what they wanted. After setting up their campsite, which included 2 tents, one for Min and Fong to share and one for Lon, they built a small fire and settled in for the evening. As twilight deepened, the forest around them transformed into a wall of shadows. The crackling of the fire became the only sound, punctuated occasionally by the distant hoot of an owl. Lon leaned back against a log, staring into the flames. "This is nice," she said. "No phones, no deadlines, just us and nature." Fong grinned. "Until the mosquitoes find us." "Don't jinx it," Min replied, tossing another log onto the fire. The conversation drifted into light banter and stories from their school days. As the night grew colder, the trio retreated to their tents. Min and Fong continued to whisper jokes to each other until sleep finally claimed them. Min awoke suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. Something felt off. He sat up, his heart pounding for no discernible reason. That's when he noticed it. A sound, faint but distinct, like footsteps on the dry leaves outside. "Fong," he whispered, nudging his friend awake. "Do you hear that?" Fong groaned and rubbed his eyes. "Hear what?" The footsteps grew louder, circling their tent. Min's breath hitched. "That! Someone's out there." Fong sat up, suddenly alert. The two of them listened in tense silence. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Min reached for the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The forest was still, the faint light of the crescent moon casting long shadows. There was no sign of anyone. "Probably an animal," Fong said, though his voice wavered. "Go back to sleep." Min reluctantly zipped the tent back up, but sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake for hours, listening to the forest, until exhaustion finally overtook him. The next morning, the unease from the night before lingered. Min mentioned the footsteps to Lon as they prepared breakfast. "You're sure it wasn't just the wind or something?" Lon asked. Min shook his head. "It was footsteps, human footsteps." Fong chimed in. "I heard it too, but when we looked, there was nothing there." Lon frowned but said nothing. They decided to explore the hilltop after breakfast to shake off the lingering tension. The view from the summit was breathtaking. The valley below bathed in golden sunlight. For a while, the strange events of the night before were forgotten. As evening approached, the friends returned to their campsite and rekindled the fire. This time, Lon suggested they stay up together for a while. "Just in case," she said with a nervous laugh. The night passed uneventfully. They shared ghost stories and laughed nervously at the imagined horrors. By the time the fire burned low, they felt more relaxed. Lon yawned. "All right, I'm calling it a night." She crawled into her tent, leaving Min and Fong to douse the fire. The two men soon followed, their tent now feeling like a safe haven against the dark. Min awoke again, this time to the sound of rustling fabric. He turned to see Fong already sitting up, his face pale in the faint moonlight. "What is it?" Min whispered. "Lan's tent," Fong replied, his voice trembling. "Someone's in there." Min's stomach dropped. He grabbed the flashlight and unzipped their tent as quietly as possible. The beam of light swept across the campsite and landed on Lan's tent. The zipper was half open, and the fabric moved as though someone inside was shifting. "Lon," Min called out. No response. He stepped out, his heart pounding, and approached the tent. Fong followed closely, carrying a makeshift weapon, a large stick he'd found earlier. Min reached for the zipper, his hands shaking, and pulled it open. The tent was empty. Lan's sleeping bag was neatly arranged, her belongings untouched, but there was no sign of her. "Lon!" Min called again, louder this time. The forest swallowed his voice. Fong's grip on the stick tightened. "Where is she?" Min's flashlight caught something on the ground near the tent. A trail of footprints leading away into the woods. The prints were faint but unmistakable, heading deeper into the darkness. "We have to find her," Min said, his voice firm despite the fear creeping into his chest. The two of them followed the trail, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the oppressive shadows. The woods seemed alive with sounds. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant whispers that made their skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, they came to a small clearing. In the center stood another tent. It was identical to Lan's, down to the color and the way the flap was half open. "What the hell?" Fong whispered. Min stepped forward cautiously. "Lon, are you in there?" There was no answer. He shone the flashlight inside, his breath catching in his throat. The interior was identical to Lan's tent, complete with a sleeping bag and her belongings. But Lon was nowhere to be found. Fong's voice wavered. This doesn't make any sense. A sound behind them made both men whirl around. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure. It was small and indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. "Lon," Min called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Without thinking, Min and Fong gave chase. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as they ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure always seemed just out of reach. Eventually, they stumbled into another clearing. This one was different. The ground was covered in disturbed soil, and in the center stood a cluster of tents, identical to the ones they had seen before. Each tent was arranged in a perfect circle, their flaps open and waiting. The sense of wrongness was overwhelming. Min and Fong backed away, their instincts screaming at them to run. But as they turned to leave, the shadows around them seemed to shift. Figures emerged from the trees, their faces obscured, their movements slow and deliberate. Min's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, the whispers grew louder, surrounding them. The last thing Min remembered was a cold hand gripping his arm and a voice, soft, melodic, and impossibly close, whispering his name. When Min opened his eyes, the sun was rising. He was lying on the forest floor near their original campsite. Fong was beside him, groaning as he stirred awake. Lan's tent was still there, but it was empty. They searched the hilltop for hours, calling Lan's name, but she was gone. The footprints, the second tent, the circle of identical shelters, all of it had vanished. They returned to the city in silence, their once bright memories of the trip replaced by an unspeakable dread. Lan was never found, and neither Min nor Fong spoke of what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, Min would hear whispers in the darkness, calling his name.